So by 1932, the United States economy had reached rock bottom, and many Americans saw no end in sight to their struggles. President Hoover was known as a do-nothing president to the public, with many blaming him directly for their problems. However, the country entered election season, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of optimism. Once the country had its say at the polls in November, a new president was soon to take over. As you are listening today, your focus should be on this new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and how he effected change to bring the United States out of the Great Depression. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the three components of FDR's New Deal, as well as examples of how each of those components helped to improve the economy. First, we need to take it back to just prior to FDR's election. As the presidential election of 1932 approached, President Herbert Hoover had softened his policy of trying to stay out of the economy as much as possible, and instead began a handful of government programs to try and stimulate the economy. This includes the Reconstruction Finance Corporation from last lesson. However, most Americans felt he had done too little too late. They viewed Hoover as a cold and helpless man in response to the economic crisis of the Great Depression and began to look for a new leader. Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt promised Americans a New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as FDR, won over voters by relating to their hardships with stories of his difficulties having polio. In his inauguration speech, he said, "This nation asks for action, and action now. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." His willingness to try new government programs gave Americans hope. FDR's wife, Eleanor, served as her husband's eyes and ears. Because of his polio, he couldn't travel as frequently. Eleanor traveled the country, meeting Americans and listening to their experiences. She changed the role of First Lady with her active involvement in political roles. President Roosevelt began his presidency by taking important steps to boost confidence in Americans. First, he tackled the bank crisis by temporarily issuing a bank holiday and only allowing stable banks to reopen. Roosevelt also used the technology of radio broadcast to reach Americans in their living rooms. He gave the first of many fireside chats on March 12, 1933. He continued giving fireside chats throughout his presidency, which allowed him to reach Americans directly. Roosevelt began his New Deal by pushing a record of 15 bills through Congress in his first 100 days in office. Imagine there's been an accident and you've seriously hurt your arm. You need more than a Band-Aid. Get to the hospital quick. This is an emergency. You are in extreme pain. First, you need a pain reliever. This temporarily helps you deal with the pain. It's helpful, but it wears off after a bit. Next, you will need hospitalization. You will need to be cared for by the doctor and nurses and need help with daily tasks for a while until you can get back on your feet. This helps shorten your recovery period. And lastly, you may need surgery. If your bones have trouble healing, you will need surgery to permanently correct the problem. Now we can use these analogies for helping our nation out of the Depression. Relief, recovery, and reform were the three components of FDR's New Deal. The Great Depression was an economic emergency, and Americans were feeling the pain. President Roosevelt's New Deal consisted of three components. First, relief was immediate and temporary emergency relief to unemployed Americans. It treated the symptoms of the Great Depression. Recovery was long-term but not permanent solutions. They were meant to get industry and agriculture up and running. Lastly, reform meant permanent changes to solve the problems that created the Depression in the first place. These programs still exist today. Several new programs were designed to provide emergency relief for the 13 million Americans who were unemployed. The Federal Emergency Relief Act gave money to each state to help them open soup kitchens and bread lines to feed people in need. The Civilian Conservation Corps paid men to work on environmental projects such as replanting forests, draining swamps, and fighting fires. The Works Progress Administration created more than 8 million immediate but temporary jobs. WPA employees built 120,000 public buildings and 500,000 miles of road. The Civil Works Administration temporarily employed young single adults to do city jobs like repairing roads and building parks. Even with temporary measures in place, Roosevelt believed that ending the Great Depression would take longer-term government programs to get families, businesses, and farmers back on their feet. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a project headed by the federal government to build a dam and irrigation system along the Tennessee River. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration paid farmers to plant less crops and raise fewer animals. This helped to stabilize the price of crops and meant farmers would still get paid for what they grew. And lastly, the Homeowners Loan Corporation gave low-interest loans to homeowners to prevent families from losing their houses and farms. Besides providing relief and recovery from the depths of depression, the New Deal included reforms that would prevent such a depression from ever happening again. These programs are still in place today. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, otherwise known as the FDIC, was created to guarantee people's bank deposits would remain safe, at the time up to $2,500, and restricted banks from trading stocks and making risky loans. The Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, required companies to publish important facts about their corporations so investors could avoid making risky choices in the stock market. The Social Security Act provides pensions and retirement money each month to people over the age of 65 or who cannot work due to illness or disability. The New Deal was a series of legislation passed through Congress and signed into law by President Roosevelt. This legislation established programs with three goals: immediate relief for the needy, economic recovery for families, businesses, and farms, and government reform to permanently fix the problems that had led to the Great Depression. So, how effective was it? Not all Americans felt this was the right approach. Economists today still argue over the effectiveness of Roosevelt's New Deal legislations. The Great Depression was not immediately resolved. The economy did not fully recover until the 1940s when America entered World War II. However, the New Deal and FDR gave Americans the feeling that the government was helping. Americans elected FDR to 4 terms as president, and that says a lot. So now that we are at the end, how did President Roosevelt effect change to help the United States recover from the Great Depression? What were the 3 components of his New Deal legislation?